When we think of pirates, we often picture those who were active in the Caribbean during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Extravagantly dressed, armed with cutlasses and pistols, ready to seek out new treasures aboard their sailing ships with the Jolly Roger flying from the topmast. Modern media has certainly reinforced this stereotype, but as we will explore in this video, the historical truth is somewhat obscured by myth and fantasy. This is the story of the real pirates of the Caribbean. The discovery of the Americas by Europeans in the late 15th century paved the way for the exploration and eventual settlement of the continent in the following decades, primarily by the Spanish. The founding of these new colonies led to the establishment of trade and commerce between the Old World and the New, with people and manufactured goods sailing to the Americas and viable raw materials such as tobacco, sugar, gold and silver, making the journey back to Europe. By the mid-16th century, the political situation in Europe was factional, to say the least. The leading superpower at the time was Spain, with its constant overseas expansion, empire and increasing material wealth, saving only jealousy and animosity among its European rivals, particularly France. The rise of the Protestant Reformation also divided Europe along religious and sectarian lines, with some nations, such as the Netherlands and England, choosing to break with the Catholic faith and oppose the influence of the Pope, and ultimately Spain, which was its army and forces. The French, English and Dutch, all sea-foam nations, also wanted empires and wealth of their own, but these ambitions would inevitably draw them into conflict with Spain. Rather than continue the costly and destructive wars in Europe, they saw the opportunity to attack the more vulnerable Spanish possessions in the New World, mainly by stealing their treasure ships richly laden with gold and silver, as well as plundering their strategically important settlements on what became known as the Spanish Main, such as Cartagena, Portobello, and Panama, and the Caribbean settlements of Havana and Santo Domingo. All of these factors led to the rise of piracy in the Caribbean. Initially, such activities were dominated mainly by French privateers. The distinction between this and illegal piracy was that the privateers were sanctioned by the state, with a letter of marque effectively giving them permission to rob and plunder their Spanish targets in exchange for a percentage of the spoils to the issuer, in this case, the French crown privateers. Privateers such as Jean Fleury, François Leclerc, and Jacques de Sores wreaked havoc on Spanish cargo shipping arrangements, capturing large amounts of treasure in the process. Later in the 16th century, war broke out between England and Spain, leading to the rise of English privateers in the Caribbean, such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir Richard Hawkins, and Sir Walter Raleigh. They also shared in the success of their French counterparts. However, with no nation permanently based in the Caribbean at the time, their raids had limited impact on the Spanish, as the privateers eventually had to return to Europe. The Spanish also responded to this new threat by inserting heavily armed escorts into their treasure fleet, in an effort to deter further raids by privateers. In the early 17th century, Spain still held most of the lands in the Caribbean. However, French, English and Dutch colonists began to settle on other islands and began to raid the less frequented parts of Spanish territory. Around 1625, a small number of French colonists began to eke out an existence on the northwest coast of Hispaniola. To sustain themselves, they hunted local wild animals and smoked their meat over wooden frames in a process known as boucan, which would later give rise to the name Buccaneers, literally meaning those who smoke meat. This eventually became anglicized to Buccaneers, but by this point they were hunters, rarely outright pirates. In response, the governors of the Spanish dominions ordered attacks and raids on these fledgling settlements to drive out any potential competition and to secure the interests of their own settlements. As a result, the Buccaneers fled Hispaniola and moved to the nearby island of Tortuga. Soon after, in 1629, the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis, which were jointly settled by the English and French, were attacked by the Spanish. On this occasion, most of the English settlers simply returned to the island once the Spanish had left, as did some of the French. However, most of the French settlers decided to start over and join their pirate compatriots on the island of Tortuga. It was here in Tortuga, around 1630, that pirates turned to piracy en masse due to the lack of natural resources to sustain themselves and the opportunity to seek revenge against their now hated Spanish. They began attacking their treasure ships, making the return voyage to Europe and taking the spoils for themselves. Over the next few years, the Spanish attempted to remove the Buccaneers from Tortuga. Although they had some initial success, they ultimately failed in the long run as the pirates returned in ever greater numbers, with more and more French, English and Dutch colonists turning to piracy against their common enemy, the Spanish. In 1640, French engineer Jean de Vasseur arrived in Tortuga and began building a fort overlooking the harbour to protect against future attacks. Fort de Rocher, as it became known, had a large battery of cannons and provided safe haven for pirates of all nationalities in exchange for a small share of the loot they captured. Tortuga then became the first pirate port in the Caribbean. By this time, the pirates had begun to call themselves the Brothers of the Coast and organized themselves into a loose coalition against the Spanish. Before each raid, they would elect a captain to lead the expedition, and then adopt codes of conduct known as articles that set out the rules and regulations for the duration of their voyage. By the standards of the time, these were fairly democratic and egalitarian, as they allowed for the removal of the captain if he was deemed unfit or unpopular. They also laid out how the treasure and plunder would be distributed, with each pirate receiving a share according to his rank and profession. The captain would receive the largest share, followed by the important positions such as surgeon and carpenter, and lastly, the rest of the crew would receive their shares. The codes of conduct even set out how the men were to be punished for insubordination, which ranged from having their pay taken away to being whipped, depending on the severity of the case. In the most serious cases of desertion or treason, the guilty party would be sentenced to execution or abandoned on a desert island with a few basic provisions and left to their own devices. The Buccaneers were becoming too much of a threat to the Spanish. So in 1654, they invaded the island, and after a 9-day siege, the Buccaneers surrendered and were forced to leave Tortuga. After a brief period of occupation by a Spanish garrison, the fortifications were demolished to ensure that if the pirates returned, they could not use it as a base again in the future. However, the pirates eventually returned to Tortuga. By 1660, they were made up mostly of Frenchmen and decided to take control of the island in the name of France. After appointing a new governor, they decided to build another fort called Fort Blondel near the ruins of the previous Russian fort. This change in the island's demographics was accelerated by the English capture of Jamaica in 1655 and the gradual preference of English pirates to use Port Royal rather than Tortuga. It should be noted, however, that pirates still mixed with each other and used both ports, despite letters of marque being issued against Spanish targets by both the English and French governors of Jamaica and Tortuga, respectively. As Port Royal grew in importance, fortifications were built, and the governor at the time also extended an invitation to the Brethren of the Coast to come and use the port as a base for their raids into the Spanish Empire. Early activity at Port Royal was dominated primarily by privateers issued with letters of marque. One such privateer was Christopher Mings, whose career was noted for numerous attacks on settlements on the Spanish Main. However, the pinnacle of his achievements would come in 1663. when he commanded the largest fleet of buccaneers ever assembled and led a raid on San Francisco in Campeche. Also part of this raid was one of the most famous buccaneers of all time, Henry Morgan. Morgan's early career was noted for his successful plundering of Spanish ships and returning the spoils to Port Royal. This earned him a good reputation, and in 1667 he was issued with another letter of marque to raid more Spanish ships. However, under this agreement, he was not allowed to raid Spanish settlements. Well aware of the immense wealth that these Spanish settlements possessed, he decided to ignore the details in his letter of marque and instead led the raid on Portobello in 1668, followed by further raids on Maracaibo and Gibraltar later in the year. In 1669 and then in 1671, he led the largest raid of his career, attacking Panama, earning him a vast fortune in the process and later a knighthood from King Charles II of England. Other famous pirates of the Buccaneer era were John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, and John Sawkins, who in 1680 launched what would become one of the largest pirate raids of all time, known as the Pacific Adventure. They first sailed into the Gulf of Darien, then marched through the Darien Gap and allied with local Indian tribes to attack a nearby Spanish fort. They then sailed to Panama, attacking a Spanish fleet anchored in the harbor and capturing a number of ships before rescuing the town. Finally, they sailed all the way back to the Caribbean via Cape Horn. As a result of these raids, Port Royal became one of the most prosperous settlements in the Caribbean, resulting in a population of around 6,500 by 1692. This attracted not only pirates and privateers, but also merchants and artisans, as well as an increasing number of prostitutes and tavern keepers interested in making the pirates part with their abundant treasures. Indeed, Port Royal became widely known for its debauchery. One contemporary of the time wrote that wine and women drained their wealth to such an extent that some of them were reduced to begging. They were known to spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of eight in a night, and one gave a prostitute $500 to see a nude, which they used to buy a pipe of wine, place it in the street, and force everyone who passed by to drink it. All this came to an abrupt halt on June 7, 1692, when a devastating earthquake struck Port Royal and destroyed much of the northern half of the city, sinking beneath the waves. Although efforts were made to rebuild the city, it never fully recovered. Even before this, Port Royal had begun to transition away from its privateering economy to one of slave trading and plantation farming, such as sugarcane. Anti-piracy laws were even introduced to keep buccaneers out so much that Port Royal went from being a pirate utopia to becoming the place where many of them would later be executed. The decline of what was known as buccaneering in the late 17th century had many reasons. Firstly, peace with Spain meant that fewer letters of marque were issued and, subsequently, there were fewer legitimate targets for plunder. Secondly, frequent infighting and disagreements between the English, French, and Dutch pirates eventually caused them to fragment into their respective nationalities. Thirdly, the erratic nature of piracy and the irregular financial rewards it brought caused some to seek a more stable way of life. Some returned to Europe, while others tended to colonize the lands of the Caribbean and Central America as planters and loggers. Finally, the European powers recruited many of these experienced sailors into their respective navies to suppress piracy in the region and promote secure mercantile trade. Eventually, this left only a decreasing number of true outright pirates operating in the Caribbean. After the decline of the Buccaneers, the few remaining pirates turned their attention to plundering the riches of the Indian Ocean instead. The Pirate Round, as it became known, involved sailing around the Cape of Good Hope and targeting the merchant ships of the East India Companies, as well as local Mughal and Arab traders. Once they had captured this prize, the pirates would make the return journey to ports in the Caribbean and North America to sell their captured treasure. Probably the most famous pirate to undertake this journey was Henry Avery, who in 1696 sailed his ship to the port of Nassau in the Bahamas to try to unload some of the treasure he had recently acquired. The Bahamas at the time was a severely underpopulated English colony and vulnerable to attack by the French and Spanish. In an effort to increase both manpower and firepower in his defense, the governor at the time allowed Avery and his crew to anchor in Nassau, hoping that they would deter any future attacks. In return, the governor received a large bribe from Avery and turned a blind eye to the ill-gotten gains, allowing a safe haven for the pirates. Although Avery only stayed in Nassau for a short time, he established the port as a credible base for future pirate operations. The outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701 resulted in many of Nassau's colonists fleeing due to the steady increase in attacks by the French and Spanish. At the same time, however, more and more English privateers began to use Nassau as a base of operations and soon outnumbered the mere 100 or so colonists who remained on the island. By 1714, the war was over, and so were the legitimate targets of enemy shipping for the English privateers. Now deprived of any possible income and with no employment opportunities elsewhere, many remained true to what they knew, seafaring, and simply turned to piracy, continuing to use Nassau as their home port. This established what would come to be known as the Pirate Republic, a loose confederation of pirate captains, crews, and ships who were governed by a code of conduct not unlike that of their buccaneer predecessors some 60 years earlier. Pirates and other privateers flocked to Nassau from across the Caribbean and the American colonies, and effectively took control of the island. Their numbers were also swelled by scores of demobilized sailors, both from European navies and merchant ships, sailors seeking to escape the terrible pay and brutal conditions aboard merchant ships. Similarly, many runaway slaves and black sailors were also attracted to the freedom and egalitarian spirit that the Pirate Republic offered. So much so that there were an estimated 5,000 pirates active in the Caribbean between 1715 and 1725. It is said that nearly 1 in 3 were of African heritage. The Pirate Republic, with its democratically elected leaders, equitably distributed plunder and lack of social rules, proved immensely attractive to many sailors of the time who would otherwise have been grossly underpaid for their hard and dangerous work. This is perhaps best summed up by the words of pirate Captain Bartholomew Roberts. In honest service there is little, low wages and hard work. In this plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power, and who would not balance the balance on this side when all the risk we run for it, the worst is only a sour look or two to choke on. Within the Pirate Republic, there also emerged a nucleus of the most notorious and feared pirates known as the Flying Gang, initially led by Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings. The gang grew to include all the famous pirates of the time, such as Charles Vane, Calico Jack, Jack Rackham, Sam Bellamy, Mary Red, Anne Bonny, and probably the most famous of all, Blackbeard. Being mostly of English extraction, the pirates were prone to patriotic favor and remained loyal to their own cause, targeting only French and Spanish ships. However, the increasing numbers of British-flagged merchant ships plying the Caribbean shipping lanes eventually proved too much of a temptation for the pirates. Some crews even complained to their captains, frustrated that they were missing too many easy targets. Eventually, merchant ships of all nationalities were considered fair game, and the pirates plundered with impunity.